Have you ever stopped to think that it's possible to reach a point in life where we miss the life we dreamed of but never actually lived? Some people miss places where they never lived, conversations they never had, opportunities they never accepted, a city they never moved to, a person they may never have met, or a version of themselves that never came to exist. And that seems strange, because, in theory, longing should be connected to something that happened, to a real memory. But the human mind is more complex than that. Sometimes, it doesn't miss only what it lost. It also misses what it imagined, what it desired, what could have been, a life that, at some point, seemed possible, but never became real. And perhaps one of the quietest forms of pain is exactly this: missing a life you deeply wanted, one you dreamed of in childhood or adolescence, a life that was never yours, but that, somehow, still feels like it belongs to you. You look at your current life, at your routine, at your choices, at the path you ended up taking, and, for a few seconds, you imagine another version, a version in which you made different decisions, said yes, said no, left, stayed, started earlier, didn't give up, took more risks, grew up in a different environment, and then a difficult question appears. Who would I be if that life had happened? That question may seem simple, but for some people, it opens a very deep emotional door, because it isn't just about curiosity. It isn't imagining just for the sake of imagining. It is feeling a kind of grief over a possibility. It is looking at something that never existed, and, even so, feeling that something was lost. In psychology, there is a very interesting concept called the possible self. They are the versions of ourselves that the mind is able to imagine, who we could have been, who we believe we would have become if certain things had happened differently. These possible selves are not just random fantasies. They are part of the way we organize our identity. The human mind does not live only in the present. It is always comparing who we are with who we were, with who we could have been, and with who we might still become. That is how we create direction, hope, regret, fear, motivation, and also suffering. Because when an imagined version of ourselves begins to feel more alive than real life, something inside the mind comes into conflict. A person lives one life, but feels the presence of another. And, little by little, that unlived life begins to take up space inside them, not as a memory, but as a possibility that never came to rest. That is why this topic is so curious, because the person is not only stuck in the past, they may be stuck in a future that never arrived, a future that was imagined, rehearsed, desired, maybe even planned, but that did not happen. Those are the moments in the past when we stop and think, when this or that happens, I'll be happy. When I'm in that city, I'll do this. When I'm with that person, I'll be better. But what if the present life is not compatible with everything that was dreamed of and projected? Where do all the feelings that were waiting for that to happen go? And what did not happen is sometimes harder to let go of than what came to an end. When something real ends, there is a clearer ending, a conversation, a goodbye, a visible loss. But when a possibility dies, often there is no ceremony. No one says, "I'm sorry for the life you were not able to live." One path simply starts to fall behind. A door is not opened. A desire is swallowed by routine. And by the time the person realizes it, that thing is no longer a concrete possibility. It is a parallel life inside the imagination. A life that never happened, but that still creates longing. This can happen in many ways. Someone may miss the person they would have been if they had chosen another profession. Maybe they look at artists, writers, teachers, travelers, entrepreneurs, researchers, musicians, or people who followed freer paths, and feel something hard to explain. It is not simple envy. It is not merely admiration. It is a feeling of recognition, as if they were saying, "There is a part of me that could have lived that." Another person may miss a love that never happened, not necessarily someone specific, but the experience of being chosen in a calm, safe, whole way. They may miss a relationship they never had, an emotional home that never existed, an intimacy they imagined, but never lived. Another person may miss a city, a life in another country, a more affectionate family, a more protected childhood. And that is where the longing for an unlived life becomes even deeper. Because often, we do not miss only choices, We miss conditions, opportunities, support, an environment that would have allowed certain parts of us to grow. When someone says, "I miss a life I never lived," perhaps they are saying something bigger. I miss the person I could have become if I had had more room. And that is very human, because all of us carry interrupted versions. Parts of ourselves that were left along the way, dreams that did not receive enough water, desires that were silenced too early, paths that seemed possible, but that life, fear, lack of support, or circumstances gradually pushed away. The problem begins when that imagined life starts to compete with real life. The person begins to look at the present as if it were always a smaller version. The current job seems smaller than the talent they did not develop. The city where they live seems smaller than the place they never went to. The current relationship seems smaller than the love they imagined. The routine seems smaller than the freedom they wanted. And when that happens, real life begins to lose its brightness. Not because it is necessarily bad, but because it is being compared to a life that never faced reality. This point is important. The imagined life almost always seems more beautiful because it was never tested. It did not have bills to pay. It did not have real conflicts. It did not have frustrations. It did not have losses. It did not have a tired body. It did not have ordinary days. In the imagination, the unlived life can remain perfect. It stays frozen at its best angle, like a beautiful scene that never had to continue after the cut. And this is one of the mind's most powerful tricks. It compares a complete reality, full of imperfections, with an edited possibility. And in that comparison, reality almost always loses, because real life has dust. It has mistakes. It has exhaustion. It has difficult conversations. It has confusing phases. The imagined life, on the other hand, can remain clean, untouched, ideal. It never had to deal with the weight of existing. That is why, when someone misses a life they never lived, one of the first psychological questions is this longing revealing a truth or an idealization? Sometimes it reveals both. There may be a truth there. Maybe the person really did ignore an important desire. Maybe they chose security when they needed expansion. Maybe they silenced a creative part of themselves. Maybe they spent years trying to please others and now miss themselves. But there may also be idealization. The mind may be turning the unlived path into a kind of emotional paradise, a place where everything would have worked out, where the person would be happier, more loved, more secure, freer. But no human path is free of pain. That other life would also have problems. It would also have losses. It would also have regrets. It would also have days when the person would ask, "What if I had chosen differently?" This is an important part of emotional maturity. Understanding that every choice creates one life and closes off others. Choosing one path means, at the same time, abandoning parallel paths. When you decide to stay in one place, you lose the life that would have happened if you had left. When you decide to leave, you lose the life that would have happened if you had stayed. To live is to choose, and to choose is to lose. Not because every choice is wrong, but because we cannot live all possible lives. And perhaps part of the longing for a life never lived comes exactly from that, from the difficulty of accepting that we are limited beings. We have limited time, a body, a story. We cannot experience every version, and the mind suffers in the face of that impossibility. It wants to compare. It wants to simulate. It wants to discover what would have happened on every path. But real life does not work that way. Real life requires us to move forward without knowing what would have happened on the other side. Some people deal with this well. Others get stuck in the what if. And what if is one of the most human questions there is. What if I had accepted that opportunity? What if I had studied that? Reflecting on what did not happen can bring awareness. Ruminating on what did not happen can bring suffering. Reflection asks, what does this possibility teach me about what I value? Rumination asks, what would my life be like if I hadn't ruined everything? Reflection brings information. Rumination brings guilt. If you miss a freer life, perhaps there is a need for freedom asking for space now. If you miss a more creative life, perhaps your creativity has not died. Maybe it simply has no place. If you miss a more loving life, perhaps you need to look at the way you choose bonds today. Not every imagined life needs to be recovered literally. Sometimes, it needs to be translated. Maybe you cannot live that exact life, but you can understand what it represented. Freedom, movement, affection. When the mind insists on a life that never happened, perhaps it is saying, there is something here that still matters. Not necessarily that person, that city, that path, that profession, but the emotional meaning all of it carried. This is a central point. The longing for an unlived life can be a disguised message. It may be showing a need that was ignored for a very long time. Maybe you do not miss living somewhere else. Maybe you miss feeling free. Maybe you do not miss a specific person. Maybe you miss being looked at with desire, care, or curiosity. Maybe you do not miss an old career. Maybe you miss using a part of yourself that became dormant. Another important point is that longing for an unlived life does not always come only from regret. Sometimes it comes from comparison. We live surrounded by images of alternative lives. Social media constantly shows people living in beautiful places, changing careers, living great love stories, traveling, creating, winning, starting over. And the mind looks at all of that and thinks, that could have been my life. But caution is needed, because what we see of others is usually a fragment, a scene. We do not see the emotional cost, the doubts, the fear, the loneliness, what happens behind the scenes. A person may be comparing their own complete life with the emotional showcase of someone else's life, and this increases the feeling that something was lost. Comparison feeds the grief for unlived lives. Sometimes, the person you envy does not have the life you were supposed to have. They are simply showing something you abandoned in yourself, and that changes everything. Because instead of turning comparison into self-punishment, you can turn it into investigation. What exactly touched me here? What need of mine did this image awaken? Is there a small way to bring this into my current life? Another important point is learning to talk to the version of yourself that was left behind. Many people try to forget that version. They try to ignore it. They try to say it does not matter, but perhaps it needs to be acknowledged. The version that wanted to be an artist. The version that wanted to love without fear. The version that wanted a different family. The version that wanted to have been protected. Perhaps that version does not need to govern your life, but perhaps it needs to be heard. You can say, internally, I know you existed as a possibility. I know that loss hurt. I will not pretend nothing happened, but I will also not abandon the life that still exists. This kind of acknowledgement is important, because sometimes a person gets stuck not because they lost a possibility, but because they were never able to mourn it. They were never able to say, I wanted that. I lost that. I miss the person I could have been. When we do not name the loss, it keeps appearing in other ways, as irritation, comparison, envy, a feeling of being behind. Naming it does not solve everything, but it organizes things, and the mind needs organization in order to move on. That is why it may be healthy to allow an honest grief for the lives that did not happen, not to live inside it, but to stop pretending it does not exist. The unlived life hurts more when the current life is disconnected from what you truly value. When a person lives aligned with their values, even if they have regrets, the longing for alternative lives tends to feel lighter. But when a person lives far from themselves, any imagined life seems more alive than the real one. So perhaps the final question is your longing stuck in the past, or is it exposing something in the present? Because if it is exposing something in the present, there is still something you can do. Maybe you do not need to change everything. Maybe you simply need to stop ignoring certain signs. It may require admitting that something is not working, but the fear of starting over does not prove that the path is wrong. Sometimes, it only proves that you spent a long time convincing yourself that you could not change. And we truly cannot change what has already happened, but we can change the present. And in the end, perhaps the goal is not to completely stop missing the lives we never lived. Perhaps the goal is to live the current life with so much presence and truth that those other lives stop seeming like the only way out. If this video made you think of a version of yourself that was left behind, write in the comments which part touched you the most. And if you like understanding the invisible patterns of the mind, human behavior, and emotions that almost no one can explain, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes what seems like longing is actually the mind trying to show you a part of yourself that still wants to live. And when you learn to listen to that part, you may discover that the life that did not happen does not have to be only a wound. It can be the beginning of a new choice. Thank you so much for making it this far, and I'll see you in the next video.